The United States just handed Canada an ultimatum, 5 demands. Meet them all, or the trade deal that holds North American commerce together gets torn up. And Canada's response? No, not to 1 demand, not to 3, to all 5. Now, before you assume this is economic suicide by a country 1/10 the size of the American market, consider this. The United States imports 3.8 million barrels of Canadian crude oil every single day, and the refineries that process it physically cannot run on anything else. Canada did not just say no. Canada said no because it can. Here is exactly what happened. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer laid out 5 conditions for extending the USMCA, the trade pact that replaced NAFTA, for another 16 years. The threat behind them was blunt: accept these terms or face crippling tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, automobiles, and energy. The 5 demands targeted specific pillars of the Canadian economy. First, broader American access to Canada's dairy market, where tariffs on imports above a quota threshold range from 200 to nearly 300%. Second, the repeal of Canada's digital media laws, specifically the Online Streaming Act and the Online News Act, which require platforms like Netflix, YouTube, and Spotify to reinvest revenue into Canadian content and compensate publishers for news. Third, the removal of provincial bans on American alcohol in Ontario and British Columbia, bans that were themselves retaliatory measures against earlier Trump-era tariffs. Fourth, the dismantling of provincial procurement rules that favor Canadian suppliers for public contracts. Fifth, changes to Alberta's electricity grid, which Washington alleged was discriminating against power imports from Montana. Mark Carney, functioning as Canada's chief economic strategist, responded to each demand in sequence. On dairy, he declared supply management non-negotiable and delivered his answer in French, a direct message to Quebec's farming communities. On digital media, he invoked cultural sovereignty. On alcohol, he pointed out the bans were retaliatory and would vanish the moment American tariffs did. On procurement, he highlighted the hypocrisy of a nation whose by American statutes are among the most restrictive on earth. On energy, Alberta's utilities minister flatly denied any differential treatment existed. No counteroffers. No haggling. Just no. 5 times over. None of this materialized out of thin air. These grievances have been simmering for decades inside the architecture of North American trade. Canada's supply management system for dairy dates to the 1970s, designed to stabilize farm incomes through production quotas and import tariffs rather than direct government subsidies. It has survived every major trade negotiation since, including the original NAFTA talks and the 2018 USMCA renegotiation. The digital media laws are more recent, part of a global wave. Australia passed similar legislation in 2021, forcing Meta and Google to pay news publishers. The European Union has pursued comparable frameworks. Canada is not an outlier here. It is following a well-established playbook used by mid-sized democracies trying to prevent Silicon Valley from vacuuming up their entire information ecosystem. But here is the critical context most coverage misses. Weeks before this standoff, Ottawa passed legislation permanently enshrining supply management protections in statute. This was not a political statement. It was a strategic maneuver straight out of game theory. By legally binding its own hands, Canada told Washington, "We could not give you what you want even if we wanted to." In negotiation theory, voluntarily eliminating your own flexibility can be the most powerful move on the board. Now let us get into why Carney's rejection is not bravado but math. And this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the American demands actually expose American vulnerabilities far more than Canadian ones. Start with energy, because this is where the entire American position falls apart. The U.S. imports roughly 3.8 million barrels of Canadian heavy crude every day. That number alone is significant, but volume is not the real issue. Chemistry is. The massive refinery complex along the U.S. Gulf Coast was engineered over decades to process heavy sour crude, the kind extracted from Canada's oil sands. These refineries cannot simply switch to light sweet crude from the Permian Basin in Texas. The molecular structure is different. The processing equipment is different. Retooling would cost billions of dollars and take years. Meanwhile, New England depends on Canadian hydroelectricity during winter demand peaks to keep homes heated and lights on. Washington complained about a few megawatts flowing from Montana to Alberta while ignoring the torrent of energy flowing in the opposite direction. That is not leverage. That is dependency. Look at the auto sector next, which Greer conspicuously left off his list of demands, and ask yourself why. The North American automobile industry is the most tightly integrated manufacturing system on the planet. A single component can cross the US-Canada border 6 or 7 times before ending up in a finished vehicle on a showroom floor in Michigan. General Motors President Mark Roos told Congress directly that disrupting this supply chain would cost tens of billions. Threatening tariffs on Canadian auto parts does not pressure Canada. It threatens to shut down assembly plants in Detroit, Toledo, and South Bend. This is the core miscalculation. Washington is operating on a mental model where market size equals leverage. The U.S. consumer market is 10 times the size of Canada's, therefore Canada must fold. But that model ignores what Canada actually supplies. Canada is not just a customer for American goods. It is the source of critical inputs that make American goods possible. Cut off Canadian crude and Gulf Coast refineries choke. Cut off Canadian auto parts and Midwest assembly lines stop. Cut off Canadian electricity and New England freezes. Interdependence is not a one-way street, and Carney clearly understands the traffic pattern better than Greer does. The political dimensions are equally revealing. Carney's choice to answer the dairy demand in French was surgical. In Canada, dairy farming is not merely an industry. It is a cultural institution, especially in Quebec, where it supports thousands of families and serves as a foundation of rural identity. No Canadian leader of any political party can afford to alienate Quebec on supply management and survive the next election. The domestic political cost of capitulation exceeds any conceivable trade benefit. This is a constraint that Washington either does not understand or has chosen to ignore. On the American side, the political fractures are deeper than the rhetoric suggests. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, and major energy companies all depend on frictionless cross-border trade. The populist theater of tariff threats plays well at campaign rallies, but behind closed doors, American industry is pushing back hard. Auto manufacturers have warned Congress. Energy executives have flagged refinery dependencies. Agricultural exporters stand to lose billions if Canada retaliates with restrictions on American grain, soybeans, and corn. The Trump administration is trapped between the politics of confrontation and the economics of self-preservation. Then there is the staggering hypocrisy embedded in two of these demands that deserves its own spotlight. On procurement, Washington demanded Canada dismantle provincial buy local preferences while the United States maintains one of the most aggressive domestic procurement regimes in the world. Buy American is not a suggestion. It is a sprawling web of federal statutes and agency rules that apply to everything from highway steel to Pentagon software. Demanding Canada abandon its own far more modest versions of these policies while expanding American ones is not a negotiation position. It is a punchline. On digital media, the contradiction is even sharper. The U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission are currently prosecuting antitrust cases against the same tech giants whose unrestricted market access Greer is demanding abroad. Washington wants to regulate Silicon Valley at home while forcing the rest of the world to submit to its dominance. Carney exposed this incoherence simply by refusing to engage with it. The public opinion and media dynamics add another layer of pressure. Canadian polling from Angus Reid and Ledger shows support for a tougher stance against the United States running above 60%. This is not the political environment in which any Canadian leader can afford to appear weak. American media coverage has largely framed the dispute as Canadian stubbornness, a framing that conveniently ignores the underlying economics. Internationally, the standoff is being watched with extraordinary interest. The European Union, Australia, Japan, and South Korea all face similar dynamics with American trade policy. If Canada folds, it signals every mid-sized economy on Earth that American ultimatums work. If Canada holds, it demonstrates that interdependence is mutual and that bullying carries costs. Carney's quiet outreach to Beijing on canola tariffs and electric vehicle trade was a subtle but unmistakable signal. Canada has options. And in economics, having options is the definition of power. So where does this actually go? The most probable outcome, and I would put this at roughly 60%, is a prolonged period of loud rhetoric followed by a quiet climb down. American industry will lobby against tariffs that threaten their own supply chains. Canadian negotiators will hold firm on the 5 demands while signaling flexibility on less politically charged technical issues. The USMCA gets extended, perhaps with minor cosmetic modifications that allow both sides to declare victory, but without the structural capitulations Washington demanded. A second scenario, around 25% probability, involves targeted tariffs on specific Canadian goods, proportional Canadian retaliation, and several months of economic friction before a negotiated settlement. This would cause real damage on both sides, particularly in auto and energy. The worst case, a full trade war with cascading tariffs across all sectors, sits at roughly 10%. The economic self-harm to the United States would be so severe that domestic political pressure would likely force a reversal before it reached that point. The wild card is an external shock, a sudden escalation in U.S.-China tensions, an energy supply disruption, or a financial market event that reshuffles priorities entirely. Watch 3 things over the next 6 weeks. First, the intensity of American industry lobbying against tariffs. Second, any concrete Canadian trade diversification moves toward Asian markets. Third, whether Congress begins pushing back on executive overreach. Those 3 signals will tell you more about where this is heading than anything coming out of the trade representative's office. Here's what this comes down to. We are watching a stress test of the oldest assumption in North American trade, that the biggest economy automatically holds all the cards. Mark Carney just called that assumption what it is, a bluff, backed not by nationalism but by pipeline maps, refinery specs, and supply chain data. The United States needs this relationship every bit as much as Canada does, possibly more. The only question is whether Washington figures that out before the damage is done, or after. If this analysis changed how you see North American trade, subscribe and hit the bell so you catch the follow-up as this develops. Tell me in the comments, is Carney making the right call, or is he overplaying a strong hand? And share this with someone who still thinks trade wars are easy to win. They never are.